Hi, my name's Tedrick Ratcliffe. I'm the Executive Vice President of Mississippi Forestry Association, and we welcome you today to a virtual field day. MFA has been serving as the voice of forestry in Mississippi since 1938. With more than 3,000 members statewide, we represent the diverse interests of the entire value chain of forestry. Our members, volunteers, and staff work collectively towards shared goals of landowner rights, member prosperity, environmental stewardship, and community understanding. We hope today that you'll find tools during the field day that you can take back and use on your farm. Thanks for joining in.
My name is Dave Godwin. I'm the landowner coordinator with the Mississippi Forestry Association. So I'm going to talk a little bit about managing wildlife and wildlife habitat on these working timberlands and private lands. I find that most private landowners, forest landowners, have a wildlife objective. Most landowners want to manage for wildlife and wildlife habitat and be good stewards of those wildlife resources that are using their timberlands. I think it's important when we manage wildlife on these forest lands to really understand the landowner's objectives, to understand where wildlife fits into those objectives, how high of a priority they want to put on managing wildlife on that property, and also to understand a little bit more about their specific objectives. What species are they interested in managing? It's going to be, you'll develop a different plan for somebody that's more interested in developing habitat for gray squirrels than you would somebody that was interested in managing for wild turkeys or bobwhite quail. And one of the great things that we see is just in actively managing these working timberlands, you're going to benefit wildlife and you're going to have wildlife habitat ancillary to managing your forest and your timber stands. But we also see that if you want to maximize those benefits, you often have to be a little bit more targeted and a little bit more specific with some of the practices that you use. So I think going into developing a management plan, it's really important to first understand that landowner's objectives on the wildlife side. So one of the practices that we use a lot in managing wildlife habitat in these forested landscapes would be using wildlife openings or supplemental food plots. And you know, oftentimes I get asked, what can I plant for? What can I plant for wild turkeys, or what can I plant for bobwhite quail or white-tailed deer? And the reality is that wildlife openings and supplemental food plots are an important part of our management plans. But really that habitat management starts with our forestry practices and how we manage the overall properties and the overall stands. On this property, there's a large utility right-of-way that comes right through the property, and so today we'll get to see how this landowner is utilizing that right-of-way as a developed wildlife opening itself. That's an area that they're not going to be able to grow trees in anyway, and so they're utilizing that and maintaining and managing that as a wildlife opening. Within that utility right-of-way, we're going to see some perennial clover plots that are excellent supplemental food plots for white-tailed deer, for rabbits, for wild turkeys, and other wildlife. And so there's other areas where we could maybe put wildlife food plots without interfering with space that we're going to use for growing timber. Things like perennial log landings, possibly roadsides in an area where a road has been daylighted would be an area that we could put some supplemental food plots, but we want to first manage our habitat and then consider wildlife food plots and wildlife openings to be supplemental to that. One of the things that we talk a lot about in managing wildlife is habitat diversity, and this is an excellent property to talk about habitat diversity. Today you're going to see multiple age pine stands. You're going to see some pine stands that have not been thinned yet. You're going to see some stands that have been thinned. You're going to see some natural areas like we have over here to my right, where we've got natural hardwoods and a kind of a mixed hardwood pine stand. And each of these stands bring a different thing from a wildlife habitat perspective, and it provides diversity over the entire tract of land. When we talk about managing wildlife and wildlife habitat in the timberlands, I really like to think about it in two scales. I like to talk about habitat at the ground level, and then I like to think about habitat and developing habitat from the 40,000 foot or kind of the bird's eye level. And so at the ground level, it's really about using practices to encourage and promote wildlife habitat at the ground level, the herbaceous cover that that wildlife are going to use, and it's practices oftentimes like our silvicultural practices. Today on our field day, we're going to hear a lot about thinning, and our foresters are going to talk to us about why thinning is important from a silvicultural standpoint. And I want us to look at how thinning opens up a stand, puts more sunlight onto the ground, and encourages a growth of herbaceous vegetation that's going to provide browse for our white-tailed deer to eat. It's going to provide food and cover for rabbits. It's going to provide the structure that the wild turkeys and bobwhite quail would nest and raise their broods in. From the bird's eye view, or kind of the 40,000 foot level that I like to think about, is connectivity across the piece of property. You're working with working timber landscapes. You're going to have times when you have regeneration areas and thick areas. I want to think about, from a wildlife perspective, how the wildlife will use across and throughout that property, travel corridors, using things like our streamside management zones, which we'll see an example of today, utility right-of-ways, our road systems, so that we always have some travel corridors for wildlife and have a connectivity of the different types of wildlife habitat and the different stand classes and ages that we'll see today. So I guess to summarize, when we're trying to manage wildlife within a working timber landscape, I think it's really important for us to be very clear on our objectives up front. Don't be afraid to get technical guidance. There's a lot of opportunities to get technical guidance from the Extension Service, from the State Wildlife Agency, from the State Forestry Commission, from the Mississippi Forestry Association, and other groups and agencies that can provide technical guidance to you on a management plan. It's pretty easy. Sometimes you need to be a little bit more specific if you have certain wildlife objectives, but we can easily incorporate most wildlife management objectives into these working timber plans, and that's exciting to me.
I hope you've enjoyed your time with us today. We really hope that some of the tools and techniques that have been shared are things that you can take back and add value to your farm at home. Once again, I want to say thanks for your membership and your continued support of Mississippi Forestry Association.